In 1964, I turned 21, just in time to vote for the first time. And fortunately, it was the presidential election. I grew up in a home where my parents always took voting very seriously. So it was instilled in me to vote. As a result, I voted in every election since then. I always took my right to vote for granted and never really knew about the long struggle, the persistence, the sacrifice, and the determination by women and men who worked to pass the 19th Amendment. During these past 2 years, I have become a sponge, learning all I can about the suffrage movement, attending every exhibit in DC, and looking forward to August 26th, Women's Equality Day, when we will commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. This is the amendment that allowed white and Black women throughout the United States to vote in every election. In school, we learned about how this struggle began in Seneca Falls, New York, July 1848, where names of women familiar to us, such as Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who organized the first women's rights convention. Stanton, the writer in the group, took the example of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and transformed it into what was called the Declaration of Sentiments for the convention, including the first paragraph was, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." Then a litany of affronts to the dignity and well-being of women was presented to the more than 400 in attendance. The very first grievance, and the most controversial, was, "He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to elective franchise, and he has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice." Not just women were at the convention, but many men also. And one of these was Frederick Douglass. He argued to support the inclusion of this grievance in very powerful, convincing words. Still, it just barely passed. Throughout the country, small groups, primarily of women, began to grow into large movements. Many of these leaders, including the ones I mentioned earlier, came out of the abolition movement and from the labor movements in the mills in New England. There, they learned the power of organizing and brought it to the women's movement. One of these women was Olympia Brown, the first woman ordained by a denomination, which happened to be the Universalists, in 1863. She later gave up her church and became a full-time advocate for women's suffrage and president of the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association from 1884 until 1912. She was among the few earlier suffragists still alive to vote at long last in 1920. By the early 1900s, some states allowed women to vote in all elections, especially those out in the West. Others allowed women to vote in only local elections. The right to vote for women looked different throughout the country. Women now organized into the National American Women's Suffrage Association. This was led by Susan B. Anthony. In 1915, however, Susan turned over the leadership to Carrie Catt. Carrie Catt worked for women's rights both in the states and for the Women's Rights Amendment in the Constitution. This was a very slow process, but along came Alice Paul, who we learned about in the children's story, and she wanted to take a more militant approach, much like that had been successful in England, where she had been. So she broke away from the American Women's Suffrage Association and created the National Women's Party. They focused entirely on the National Amendment, and she used those protests that she had learned in England to get the publicity that she knew she needed to convince President Wilson and the Congress to act on the National Suffrage Amendment. In early 1917, with America on the brink of war, Alice Paul's party began picketing the White House. For 2 whole years, every day, women stood in silence in front of the White House with their signs. They were called the Silent Sentinels. Their silence was the sign that women were being kept silent by not having the right to vote. The picketers were vilified as unpatriotic because that war was going on, and hundreds were arrested, imprisoned just down the road from here in what used to be the Lorton prison. They were force-fed, put in solitary confinement, and mistreated. A museum is there for you to visit, and this summer, a memorial will be dedicated in honor of these women. Finally, in January 1919, President Wilson agreed to support this amendment. The bad publicity he was getting because of the treatment of the women and the 2-year protest in front of his White House was too much for him. The House passed the amendment by 1 vote, thanks to a supporter wheeled in on a gurney to vote. The Senate passed the bill as of June 4th, but only after there were many tries to add amendments. Now it had to be ratified, and that required 36 states at the time. As a native of Wisconsin, I'm proud to say that Wisconsin became the first state to ratify. When it came down to just needing 1 state, it came down to Tennessee in July of 1920. And it was a hot summer heat, and a special session was called. The national election was coming that fall, and both parties supported the amendment, as did both presidential candidates. I mean, how could it lose? This final chapter in the ratification story in Tennessee was all new to me until I read The Women's Hour by Elaine Weiss. Her book reads like a nonfiction political thriller, a story where the suffragists face the power, bribery, dirty tricks of the politicians with careers at stake, the lobbyists of the liquor companies and the railroad industry, influence peddling, deceit, and a struggle to outsmart the very strong anti-women's voters, anti-suffrage party. One of the reasons that the southern states strongly opposed to the amendment was the fear that if all women got the vote, that would mean all Black women would also be able to vote. The leaders of the Black suffrage movement knew that fear, and so they kept a very low profile in the campaign in Tennessee. At the end of 6 weeks, the climax came down to 1 vote and down to 1 person, a male hero no less. His name was Harry Burns, a first-time young legislator and an anti-suffragist until he read a letter given to him on the floor of the House from his mother, which stated, "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat." He suddenly changed his vote, which broke the tie, and Tennessee officially ratified the amendment on August 18th. Feb Burns, his mother, became the woman who never spoke a word, but gave all women the right to vote with that letter to her son. In 1920, 10 million women went to the polls, 3 women for every 5 men to vote in the presidential election. As I learned about these suffragists, I came away with awe and renewed dedication to the right to vote for everyone. These women dedicated their lives, had the determination, sacrifice, and the courage to act. As Bill Clontz reminded us in his service, there are those ordinary people who put themselves out there and are giants among us. These women are giants for me. Sometimes there becomes a moment, a happening that leads to change. For the women's movement, it was when President Wilson agreed to support the amendment following the bad publicity in the newspapers highlighting the plight of the women at the Lorton prison. I believe we have entered another time of great change, a great awakening for the rights of justice and equality of Blacks and minority citizens in this country, emanating from the video of the death of George Floyd at the hands of the police. And just like the women's movement, it has been a long, slow process, not just for freedom, but for justice and equality. Now, the time has come and Black lives matter. Even though the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, that did not mean equality. Alice Paul recognized this and began a new fight for the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. And finally, this past year, the legislators in Virginia ratified the ERA, though there's still some hurdles before it can become amendment to the Constitution. Recently, so many efforts have been made to disenfranchise voters in this country, including the American Indians in North Dakota, who weren't allowed to register to vote in 2018 because they only had a post office address, and the legislature decided they needed a street address. And the thousands of ex-felons who have served their time and are now free around this country that aren't allowed to vote. And the old and new efforts to make it difficult to vote by mail during this pandemic in many of the states, the voter ID laws, the lack of places to vote in predominantly Black districts, creating long lines, just to name a few. We must stay diligent to these efforts to erode our democracy. We must remember our fifth principle, the right of conscience, and the use of the democratic process in the society at large. On Saturday, August 28, 1920, Carrie Catt wrote this charge to the women voters of the nation. The vote is the emblem of your equality, women of America, the guarantee of your liberty. That vote of yours has cost millions of dollars and lives of thousands of women. Women have suffered agony of soul which you never can comprehend, so that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it. The vote is a power, a weapon of offense and defense, a prayer. Use it intelligently, conscientiously, prayerfully. Progress is calling to you to make no pause. Act. When Harry Burns cast the decisive vote in Tennessee, the suffragists in the galleries broke out in this, our final song, My Country, 'Tis of Thee.